On the afternoon of September 30th, 1991, an investigator in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, walked carefully through a college chemistry lab. It was also a potential crime scene. The room was a complete mess, with construction debris all over the place and lab equipment strewn across the countertops. In fact, it was so cluttered, the investigator didn't even know where to begin. But then, he noticed something that really stood out that was laying on a nearby counter. It was a soiled rag with a handwritten note sitting right next to it. And when he read the note, he gasped, because he realized he could be the next to die. But before we get into today's story, you might be asking yourself, why is this a Monday upload? Well, get used to it, because starting now, you're going to be getting a new episode every Monday. As mentioned in prior videos, I'm going to be uploading up to 4 new videos every week. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we do upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please steal all the mail in the Like Button's mailbox, and then just go ahead and restuff it with expired pizza coupons and mysterious credit card offers. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the morning of August 19th, 1991, a 32-year-old man named Bobby Curley stood in his recently renovated kitchen in the city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He walked over to his fridge, opened it up, reached inside, and grabbed his bag lunch along with his thermos, and he was just about to head out the door and go to work, but he stopped and gave his wife Joanne a kiss on the cheek and said he loved her, and then he left for the day. So Bobby and Joanne had been married for a year, and they lived with Joanne's 4-year-old daughter, Angela, in a duplex in a working-class neighborhood. Bobby was an electrician, and so he made pretty good money, but the Curleys were by no means rich. However, Bobby knew that actually might change soon, because Joanne was on the verge of winning this big court settlement. Joanne had actually been married once before, but her husband had died in a car accident about 3 years ago. His car had collided with a tractor trailer, and the driver of that tractor trailer was eventually found to be the one at fault. And so now, Joanne's lawyers and the trucking company's lawyers were finally closing in on a financial settlement to compensate Joanne for her first husband's wrongful death. It had been a really stressful process, and Bobby had definitely noticed that Joanne had been more sullen and stressed than usual as they were going through it. But now that the case was finally wrapping up, Joanne did appear to be sort of back in good spirits. And, while nothing was official yet, it looked like they were going to receive approximately $1 million in compensation, which was obviously really exciting. In fact, the two of them were already mapping out how they might spend some of this money. Some of the ideas they had come up with included taking Angela on a few big trips, and also maybe using some of that money to finally fund Bobby having his own business, something he had always wanted to do, but lacked the resources for. But for now, the settlement was not complete, and so Bobby had to go to his normal 9 to 5 and, punch the clock and keep earning money for the family. So for today, once he was outside, he simply got into his car and made the short drive to his current job site. 10 minutes later, Bobby parked outside of a science building on the campus of Wilkes University, which was a small college in Wilkes-Barre. He saw some of the guys on his crew standing out front, waiting to be let into this building. So Bobby, who was the foreman of their crew, he got out of his car and said good morning to everyone and then walked up and unlocked the doors. Then they all went inside and got to work. And working at this location had really become a pretty big routine for this group, because by now Bobby and his crew had been coming here, working here for a few months now. And this job was a really big job. Bobby and his team were helping renovate the entire building, which included all the classrooms, all the laboratories, hallways, everything. And so they still had quite a bit of work to do. But there was another reason this job was taking as long as it was. And that was because when Bobby's crew had first shown up at the building, they had expected it to be totally prepared for them, meaning all furniture and equipment would be cleared out. But instead, they found a ton of stuff just kind of everywhere inside the building, because the building clearly had not been prepped at all. The chemistry lab, for example, still had random flasks and chemical bottles and, wet rags with weird substances on them just laying around the room. So, as a result, Bobby and his crew had been forced to do a ton of cleanup, before they even got into their jobs that they had not planned on, and it really set them back. And so now, just to stay on schedule, they were regularly putting in 12-hour days basically every day they were there. And so all these extra hours had Bobby feeling completely exhausted, and lately, he had sort of felt kind of sick almost, and he just sort of chalked that up to basically overworking. But Bobby never complained. The overtime pay was great, and he really enjoyed working with these particular guys on this crew. These guys were basically his friends. So normally, the long work days were actually kind of fun, as exhausting and awful as they were. Later that afternoon, Bobby was standing on a ladder inside of that chemistry lab, running electrical wires above the ceiling panels. And as he was doing that, he suddenly heard this loud commotion coming from across the room. Bobby realized what he was hearing were guys on his crew basically shouting and laughing. So he climbed down to see what was going on. And when he walked over there, he saw that everybody was gathered around one of the members of the crew, whose name was Sammy DePasquale. And Sammy was sort of doubled over, coughing and spitting and holding a Coke can in his hand. Another member of the crew, whose name was Robert Marconi, explained to Bobby when he walked over that somebody had swapped out Sammy's Coke with a different Coke can, one that was filled with chewing tobacco spit instead of soda. Bobby cringed. This was absolutely disgusting. Even as a prank, this was awful. But it was also sort of par for the course for the guys on Bobby's crew. This is sort of what they did. They were always playing pranks on each other to kind of lighten the mood on long work days like today. And everybody was laughing, even Sammy, who'd been the butt of the joke. And so eventually, Bobby joined in too. He thought that this was ultimately good for morale, as gross as it was. And after a minute or so, Sammy recovered from his coughing fit from drinking this disgusting liquid and vowed sort of comically to get payback on whoever switched his Coke can. Then after that, all the guys got back to work. And so Bobby, he left the group and went back over to his ladder. And as he was climbing back up, he paused about halfway because he felt this sudden wave of sickness come over him. It almost felt like he had a flu coming on, which didn't really surprise him because he had been doing all these overtime hours and he really had felt run down as a result of it. And so again, he's just sort of chalking up the way he feels to overworking. And so as Bobby is standing on this ladder, he kind of told himself, just suck it up, this'll pass. And he just stood there on the ladder. And after a minute or two, that sensation of being sick did sort of pass. And then, because he was not a complainer, he was a hardworking guy, he just pushed the sickness feeling he was having out of his mind. He climbed back up and got back to doing his wiring. But 4 days later, on the morning of Friday, August 23rd, Bobby felt worse than ever. As he made his way across the college parking lot towards the science building where his crew was still working, he felt like his feet were heavy and he was constantly short of breath. And then as the workday went on, continuing to run wires in that chem lab, Bobby got really sweaty and really hot. His coworkers noticed and kept coming up to him to ask if he needed to go home early. But even though Bobby totally did need to go home early and felt awful, he would just tell them, nope, he was just fine. And so Bobby would manage to get through that particular workday. But then at the end of the day, when it was time to go home, Bobby felt so relieved. He could not wait to just get home, crawl into bed, and sleep. But by the next morning, Saturday morning, that heavy feeling in Bobby's feet had turned into this really intense burning pain that actually went all the way up his legs. And then his hands went numb. At this point, Bobby had to admit to himself that this was not a symptom of overworking. He was sick, like something was wrong with him. So he went to his doctor. But the doctor told him that despite what he was feeling, the symptoms were not that serious. Like it didn't appear that something was seriously wrong with him. And so ultimately, he just told Bobby to, go home and get more rest. That's what you need right now. So that's exactly what Bobby did. For the rest of that Saturday and all day the next day, Sunday, Bobby didn't do anything except lay in bed. But by that Sunday evening, Bobby still felt horrible. So he picked up the phone and did something that Bobby basically never did. He called one of his coworkers and told them that unfortunately, he would not be able to come to work tomorrow. When Bobby woke up the next morning, on Monday morning, the day he had taken off from work, he was in so much pain that he couldn't even stand up on his own. His wife, Joanne, tried to help him get out of bed and go to the bathroom, but he was physically too heavy for her to lift. And so Joanne actually ended up calling Bobby's brother, David, to come over the house and help. But even with David there, who could now basically help move Bobby around the house, it was very clear to Bobby that whatever was happening to him was not some minor issue. Like, this was serious, and it clearly was not going away with rest, like the doctor had said it would. And so at some point that day, the family called an ambulance, which came and took Bobby to a nearby hospital. But by the time they got there, the pain in Bobby's legs had gotten so bad that Bobby was literally periodically screaming in pain, and he also had begun to vomit. But after several hours of nonstop pain and nonstop testing at the hospital doctors came into Bobby's room and they told him and his family that they actually had good news. They knew what was wrong with Bobby, and it was treatable. They diagnosed him with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a condition where the body's immune system attacks the nerves and causes tingling in the feet and hands. But the staff assured Bobby that all he needed was a very specific medication, and then he would feel a whole lot better. Bobby was incredibly relieved, as was his family, and that day he began taking the medication, and quickly his pain became tolerable, he stopped vomiting, and before long, he actually felt good enough that he was able to go home. It seemed like Bobby had really turned a corner here, and that everything really was going to be okay. But within just a few days of being back home again, Bobby's pain came back even worse than before, despite still taking this medication. And he also began experiencing a new symptom. His hair started falling out. On September 7th, so now a week and a half after Bobby came back from the hospital, well, he was back there again. And to Bobby's horror, this time, his doctors actually seemed kind of baffled by his symptoms. They told him that sudden extreme hair loss was definitely not a symptom of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So they told Bobby that it seemed like their initial diagnosis must have been wrong, despite the fact that the medication they gave him to treat GBS had helped him for a little while. And so the problem now was the doctors were basically at a total loss as to how to help Bobby. They really didn't know what was going on. And so for the next 9 days, doctors ran test after test on Bobby, and all the while, Bobby's pain intensified so much and became so constant that he basically fell into this almost delirious state, like the pain was completely too much. And then eventually, all these doctors who ran all these tests came back to Bobby and his family, and they just told them that we don't know what's wrong. Like, all these tests did not provide any clarity, and so basically we can't help you. And they told Bobby that now the only choice was he needed to be transferred to a bigger, more specialized medical facility in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was about 100 miles away from Wilkes-Barre. A few days later, a neurologist named Dr. Robert Brennan walked down the hallway of the bigger hospital in Hershey, Pennsylvania. He was heading to the room where his patient, Bobby Curley, was staying. And even from several yards down the hallway, Dr. Brennan could already hear Bobby screaming and cursing at the nurses. Ever since Bobby had arrived at this hospital, his behavior had gotten more and more unhinged. At one point, Bobby had even thrown medical equipment across the room. And so now Dr. Brennan had to keep Bobby physically restrained to his bed. And so Dr. Brennan, when he reached Bobby's room, took a deep breath out in the hallway, and then into the room he walked. And inside, he saw Bobby strapped down to the bed, and he was screaming and thrashing around violently. And Dr. Brennan found himself just feeling awful about it. I mean, he felt really bad for Bobby. But really, he didn't know what to do for Bobby. He and his staff had tried basically everything they could think of to try to treat Bobby's pain, but nothing had worked. And so, on this day, Dr. Brennan couldn't do anything except what he normally did, which was just stand in Bobby's room sort of helplessly as Bobby screamed and flailed in pain. But on September 22nd, so 6 days after Bobby arrived in Hershey, he finally fell silent, because on that day, he slipped into a coma. 3 days later, Dr. Brennan felt very defeated as he stepped into Bobby's hospital room. There, he saw 5 members of Bobby's family: his wife Joanne, his 4-year-old stepdaughter Angela, Bobby's adult siblings Susan and David, and Bobby's elderly mother Mary. They'd all come to be with Bobby after he had fallen into this coma. Now, they looked up at Dr. Brennan expectantly. And Dr. Brennan, he took a deep breath, and he said he had some bad news. New test results had come back, and now, based on those results, they knew what was wrong with Bobby. Dr. Brennan told the family that what Bobby was suffering from was something called thallium toxicity. And when he said this, Dr. Brennan watched the family for some kind of a reaction. But the family just stared blankly at him like they had no idea what that meant. So Dr. Brennan went on and explained that thallium is an extremely toxic chemical. In fact, it can kill anyone who touches it, ingests it, or even just inhales its fumes. And he told them that, this is really unusual because thallium is highly controlled in the United States. It's actually banned in household products. So this is not a chemical that, Bobby just could have accidentally stumbled upon. This is pretty rare. And so at this point, Dr. Brennan just paused and let the family sit with this new information. And the family, they looked at each other like, wow, this is awful, but nobody knew how to react. They just kind of looked back at the doctor, waiting for him to explain more. But when the doctor didn't say anything, Bobby's sister, Susan, just asked in a quavering voice, what can we do? At that point, Dr. Brennan just shook his head and said, unfortunately, there's no cure for thallium poisoning. 2 days later, on September 27th, Joanne stood next to her unconscious husband in the hospital, and she nodded at the medical staff that was gathered all around him. It was ultimately Joanne's decision whether or not to keep Bobby on life support. But with no hope of a cure, Joanne had ultimately decided that the best thing to do was to take him off life support. And so after giving the signal to medical staff, Joanne, her daughter, and the rest of Bobby's family, they kind of stepped back from the bed, and they watched as the staff walked over and removed Bobby's ventilator. And then Joanne had to watch as her husband took his final breath. On the evening of October 21st, 1991, so about a month after Bobby died from thallium poisoning, a police detective named Harold Cawley sat at a big table with 7 other men inside of a steakhouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The other men were a mixture of coroners and investigators from all across Pennsylvania. Some were from the Hershey area, where Bobby had died. The rest, like Cawley, worked for the police in Wilkes-Barre, where Bobby had lived. The men were there discussing the investigation into Bobby's death, and they had been doing this for the past 3 hours already, because there really was so much to talk about. They had already covered Bobby's initial autopsy results, which showed that he had a staggering 900 times the lethal limit of thallium in his system when he died. And so they were working under the assumption that Bobby must have been poisoned by a single massive dose of thallium. Whether accidentally or on purpose, they didn't know. And so they discussed theories for how this could have even happened to him. Because remember, thallium is not just a chemical you can get from the store. This is something that is highly regulated. So how did he come in contact with it? Their first thought had been basically what everybody else suspected, which was, Bobby must have been accidentally poisoned at the Wilkes University chemistry lab where he'd been working for so many months. And they actually had a bunch of records from a preliminary examination of the lab. And according to these records, one of the first things investigators had found inside of that lab was 5 vials of thallium in one of the storerooms. They'd also found a rag that was laying out on a countertop that presumably was there when Bobby first arrived and he and his crew began cleaning everything up. And next to this rag was a handwritten note that had a warning on it that literally said, "Thallium wiping rag, touch me and die." The rag had actually caused a huge amount of panic amongst the investigators when they had gone in to begin sweeping the lab for signs of thallium, because people were fearful that maybe they'd brushed up against it and touched this rag, and were they going to get thallium poisoning? However, they actually tested the rag and it came back negative for thallium, as did all the surfaces in the lab and also the air in the lab. And so the investigators had finally decided that that note must have been a joke or something. Also, the university insisted that all of its thallium was accounted for. meaning none of it could have been, stolen or misused in some way to poison Bobby because they would know about it. And so at this point, the university had actually been sort of ruled out as where Bobby got poisoned, which really didn't make sense to Detective Cawley or the other investigators at this dinner, because again, thallium is hard to come by. The idea that Bobby was working in a lab that contained thallium, but that wasn't where he was poisoned by thallium, seemed almost impossible. It had to have happened there. But they had gone out and tested all of Bobby's coworkers who had also worked in that lab with Bobby for so many days and so many hours, and they all came back negative for thallium exposure. However, Bobby's own family, his wife Joanne and her 4-year-old daughter Angela, they had tested positive for thallium exposure. Granted, it was on a near microscopic level because any amount of exposure could actually be lethal, and those two were okay, so obviously they had not received a lethal dose, but there were very small traces of thallium in both of them, which was odd. And so everybody at the table agreed that the right thing to do here was to speak to Joanne and see if maybe she had some ideas of how she and her daughter and obviously Bobby could have maybe come in contact with this very rare and lethal chemical. And then also, they need to get inside of the family's duplex to search it, literally, for thallium. But first, there was the problem of jurisdiction. Bobby had died in Hershey, but he'd gotten sick in Wilkes-Barre. So, after some discussion, the men decided that the Wilkes-Barre police should be the ones to head up the case because that is where Bobby actually got poisoned. The next day, Detective Cawley invited Bobby's siblings, David and Suzanne, to the Wilkes-Barre police station. And right away, it was quite clear that both of them were very suspicious of Bobby's wife, Joanne. They told Cawley that Joanne had been acting really strange for months, both before and also after Bobby's death. David said when his brother had first gotten sick, Joanne had barely lifted a finger to help him. She'd called David to come over and look after Bobby, acting like she needed somebody strong enough to move Bobby around, which was true. But while David was upstairs literally carrying Bobby to and from the bathroom, Joanne stayed downstairs with her daughter and totally ignored them. She didn't even pretend to want to help. She basically let David do all of it. And Susan said, even though she didn't know for sure, her impression of Joanne right after she had taken Bobby off life support and he's died, her impression of Joanne was she was hugely relieved. Cawley listened and nodded and sort of gave the impression that he was following along and basically believed them. But inside, he wasn't really convinced that what they were describing was highly suspicious behavior. When David came over to help Bobby, that was because she had asked him to do that, after trying at first unsuccessfully to move her husband around. And then when David was there, she does have a 4-year-old daughter. She can't just leave her unsupervised. Or maybe she doesn't want her daughter to see Bobby, and so she has to keep her downstairs. So there's an explanation for that. And as for Joanne being relieved after her husband's death, everybody dealt with grief differently. And Bobby's death had been a really traumatic, drawn-out process for everybody involved. So maybe she was relieved, but not because she was happy about it. It could have just been the end of a nightmare chapter in all of their lives. And so after he had listened to their concerns, Cawley began to redirect the conversation, and he began asking David and Susan about their relationship with Bobby. They both said they were very close with their brother, even as adults. They said they lived nearby, and they saw each other quite a bit. David in particular said he spent a lot of time with Bobby. He said they often went fishing, and recently, together, they had renovated Bobby's kitchen. And this caught Cawley's attention, because it sounded like David and Bobby had finished this renovation project around the same time that Bobby first got sick. Cawley didn't know if this was relevant or not, but it was interesting. So at the end of their discussion, he just thanked David and Susan for all the information and told them they were free to go. A few days later, on the morning of October 25th, 1991, Detective Cawley and 3 other investigators sat at an interrogation table in the Wilkes-Barre police station, right across from Joanne Curley, and the lawyer that she had brought along with her. Cawley didn't know what to make of Joanne yet. Obviously, she and her daughter had also been exposed to thallium, So that could mean that they too accidentally were exposed to this chemical, same as Bobby, but obviously on a much smaller scale because they lived. Or they could have also been the target of somebody trying to poison this family, and ultimately just Bobby was killed from this poisoning. Or Joanne could be the poisoner. She could have poisoned her own husband. I mean, Bobby's siblings are talking about how awful Joanne was acting towards her husband in the wake of his illness. Maybe she poisoned him. And in doing so, she accidentally exposed herself and her daughter. Basically, Cawley couldn't tell yet if Joanne was a victim or a perpetrator. So he made sure to watch her very carefully while another investigator began asking her to explain how and when her husband first got sick. Joanne said that Bobby had been complaining about feeling pretty run down for what felt like weeks or maybe even months, but he hadn't had any major symptoms until a week before his hospitalization in August. And she said that much like Bobby, she had just kind of chalked it up to he had been overworking, or maybe he had some standard illness that would just go away with rest, like that first doctor had said. She said that she had never even heard of thallium, and really at no point had it ever crossed her mind that maybe Bobby had been poisoned by thallium. As Cawley listened to Joanne tell this story, he was struck by a couple of things. First of all, Joanne said Bobby had been feeling pretty run down for a while before his death. This seemed to conflict with investigators' assumption that a single massive dose of thallium had sent Bobby to the hospital and ultimately killed him. It seemed more likely, based on what Joanne said, that this poisoning happened over a period of time. And the second thing Cawley was struck by was actually just Joanne's general demeanor. She had just recounted in detail, the story of her husband dying, this awful, awful death. Thallium poisoning is a horrible way to die. And as she's describing it, she's not shedding a single tear or really acting at all like she's even upset about it. And so at this point, Cawley was beginning to wonder if maybe Susan and David had been right about Joanne. She really did not seem to care much about her husband's death. And so what Cawley did is he stopped the other investigator and he leaned forward and he just asked Joanne point blank, how do you explain how you and your daughter were exposed to thallium? And immediately, Joanne had a story, a bizarre one. She said Bobby really liked to drink iced tea when he was at work. So every morning, she would fill his thermos up from this big pitcher of pre-made iced tea that she kept in their fridge. And so Bobby would take that thermos with him to work and he would drink the tea all day and then come home with the thermos. And some days when he would come back, Bobby had not drank all the iced tea. There'd be some left inside the thermos. And so Joanne said what she would do in that case was she would take the remaining iced tea still in the thermos and she would pour it back into the pitcher in the fridge, basically to salvage what was left of the tea. And she said she and her daughter also drank from that pitcher. So in essence, she sometimes was drinking from the same tea that Bobby was drinking from directly. And so perhaps in that way, if he was being exposed to thallium, maybe it was getting into that tea that he was bringing home. And, she believed that maybe that was how she was being exposed, by drinking the leftover iced tea. Cawley glanced over at the other investigators in the room, and they all looked as baffled as he was. This iced tea explanation was pretty out there, but it was so weirdly specific that they really couldn't write it off. And Cawley knew that, if the iced tea theory was legitimate, it might be able to explain why all three people in this family, all living in the same place, had such drastically different levels of exposure. Basically, Bobby could be having this huge exposure to thallium outside the house, and then basically remnants of the thallium exposure are finding their way back into that leftover tea, so it's a really small amount of thallium. That's coming back home, it's being mixed inside that pitcher, and so when Joanne and her daughter are drinking from that pitcher, they're only getting a very small amount of thallium. And so again, it's out there, but it would explain it. So Cawley asked Joanne if he had her permission to not just search her whole duplex to check for thallium, but specifically check her fridge, check her pitcher, her iced tea pitcher, and all the thermoses that Bobby brought to work to see if there was still trace levels of thallium inside of them. And he was worried when he asked her this question that she might refuse or give some reason that she couldn't, but Joanne immediately agreed without any hesitation. That same afternoon, Cawley, his investigators, and a crime scene unit arrived at the Curleys' duplex to begin their search. Cawley looked on as the crime scene unit entered the duplex and immediately began scouring every surface. And they found absolutely no trace of thallium anywhere in the house, except for in one very specific location. The thermos Joanne had already told them about, the one that Bobby would bring with the iced tea in it to work and then back again. Traces of thallium were found on the little ridges at the top of the thermos where the lid screwed back on. And this was huge, not only because now they had the first clear sign of exactly where the thallium was coming in and out of Bobby's life, but more specifically because it was at the top of this cup that obviously Bobby is drinking from. This showed that the way the thallium wound up in Bobby's system was because he ingested it. That was something they didn't know at this point. Now it seems very clear that's how it happened. But despite this revelation, it didn't explain how Joanne and Angela were also exposed, because when they tested the big pitcher of iced tea in the fridge, it didn't contain any thallium. And also, just finding the thallium at the top of the thermos didn't explain how it actually got there. But for Cawley, what really stood out about finding thallium on this thermos was that this item, this thermos, is something Bobby took to work and home every single day. So it seemed like maybe, Cawley and his staff had been too quick to rule out where Bobby was working. I mean, he was working in a chemical lab that contained thallium, and they had ruled that out as the place where he could have been poisoned. Now, it seemed like they needed to take another look. Seven months later, in late May of 1992, Detective Cawley sat at his desk, thumbing through the notes from all the interviews and polygraph tests that he and his team had carried out since the previous October. One by one, they had brought in all of Bobby's coworkers and grilled them about Bobby's death. And all of the coworkers had more or less said the same thing. Bobby was well-liked, and nobody they knew would want to harm him. Some of the coworkers did admit that they did like to prank each other a lot, but they said the pranks had always been, pretty harmless, and spiking somebody's drinks with chemicals was way, way beyond anything they ever did. At least that's what all of them said. But two of Bobby's coworkers, Sammy DePasquale and Robert Marconi, had failed their polygraph exams. In fact, the polygraph examiner said those two had literally gotten the worst scores he had ever seen. So very quickly, those two shot to the top of Cawley's suspect list. And so Cawley had pressed both of them about whether or not they had pranked Bobby by putting thallium into his thermos. Maybe they didn't know how dangerous thallium was, but did they put something in his thermos? And they said absolutely not, they didn't do that. But Cawley didn't believe them, because he'd already heard about previous pranks that involved swapping out coworkers' drinks for things like tobacco spit. So what's to say they didn't put thallium in Bobby's thermos? It just sort of tracked. The problem was, Cawley didn't have any actual evidence that he could use to arrest either of them, especially since the university continued to insist that none of their thallium was missing from the lab. Now, Cawley knew it was possible the university was wrong, that maybe there was unaccounted for thallium, but he had no way to prove that. Cawley also felt pretty suspicious of Joanne and also Bobby's own brother, David. Joanne, for obvious reasons, was still suspicious. She had thallium in her system. She seemed oddly detached from Bobby when he was dying, kind of letting other people take care of him, and apparently was relieved when he was taken off life support. But even if Joanne had wanted to poison Bobby, it was really unclear how she would have gotten her hands on thallium. And then as for David, the reason he was sort of suspicious to Cawley is because he spent a lot of time with Bobby. And he also did that kitchen renovation with him. And so there's all these moments where he's alone, potentially handling chemicals with Bobby before he got sick. So basically, David had the opportunity to poison Bobby, but there really was no motive. And just like with Joanne, Cawley felt like, where would David get the thallium? That was the big question. Where is the thallium coming from? And so at this point, Detective Cawley was basically at a dead end and just did not know how to take this case, which was heartbreaking because earlier that day, he'd been informed that the district attorney had decided to actually shut down the investigation into Bobby's death. The case was officially cold. And so since Cawley could not revive it, all he could do was close the case file and stick it in a drawer. One morning in August of 1994, so more than 2 years after the investigation into Bobby's death was shut down, Detective Cawley walked up the porch steps of the duplex where Bobby had lived, and he knocked on the door. Cawley had been thinking a lot about this case recently, and today he was hoping that Bobby's widow, Joanne, would help him take one last shot at cracking it. A moment later, Joanne answered the door, and once the look of surprise left her face, she invited the detective inside. Cawley quickly explained to her that the reason he was here is because there had been this technological breakthrough in toxicology testing. The Wilkes-Barre police were now able to perform a new type of test that had not been available to them 3 years ago when her husband had died. And Cawley believed that, this information they could get would help them figure out what actually happened to Bobby once and for all. Joanne's eyes lit up at this news, and she was about to open her mouth to reply, but Cawley quickly added there was actually a catch. He said in order to do these tests, they would have to exhume Bobby's body, and the only person who could give investigators permission to do that was Joanne. Cawley waited while Joanne processed everything she had just been told. He tried not to let it show on his face, but Joanne's response to this would basically decide the entire fate of this case. If she said no, there really was nothing they could do. The evidence contained inside of Bobby's casket would be lost to them forever, which meant if somebody had intentionally poisoned Bobby, they would never figure out who it was, and so the killer would never be brought to justice. But unsurprisingly, Joanne said yes, of course. Later that month, on August 23rd, Cawley went to the cemetery where Bobby was buried, and he watched as a backhoe dug up his grave and pulled his casket out of the ground. The police and coroner then took custody of Bobby's body, and they would go on to perform these new toxicology tests. And when the results came in, they gave Cawley the exact information he had hoped for. Based on the police investigation, and critically, those new toxicology tests, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bobby Curley. The first time the killer slipped thallium into Bobby's thermos, Bobby was busy working in another room and didn't notice, which was exactly what the killer wanted. The killer did not hate Bobby. In fact, they really hadn't wanted to kill him until he had started talking about opening up his own business with that settlement money his family was going to get. And the killer just could not let that happen. Because if Bobby went into business for himself, he would ruin everything. The killer believed that by poisoning Bobby one time, that would kill him, and then all their problems would be solved. But the next day, Bobby actually seemed fine, sort of unfazed by the poison. So the next time the killer got the chance, they added a little more poison to Bobby's thermos. And when Bobby again stayed healthy the next day, well, the killer just added a little bit more the next time, and they just kept on doing that. They were afraid that if they added too much at once, Bobby might notice, and then they would get caught. So, for months, Bobby was being poisoned, but didn't really show any significant symptoms. But finally, in August of 1991, Bobby started showing really severe symptoms. Remember, his legs were in extreme pain, his hands were going numb, and when he called in sick to work on that Monday, that was when the killer knew. They were certain they had finished him off. Except they hadn't finished him off. Because when he went to the hospital, Bobby just continued to cling to life. So the killer actually went to visit Bobby in the hospital. And while Bobby was sleeping, the killer slipped a final massive amount of the poison into a soda cup that Bobby kept by his bedside. And when Bobby woke up, the killer kind of casually encouraged him to drink the soda. And Bobby did so without any hesitation because Bobby had no reason not to trust the killer. Because the killer was his own wife, Joanne Curley. She had actually started poisoning him almost a year before she actually murdered him, but investigators didn't realize this until a new type of toxicology test allowed them to figure out exactly when Bobby was being poisoned. This test worked by analyzing some of the hairs that Bobby still had left on his body. Basically, every time Bobby was poisoned, a chemical marker was left behind in his hair. So as his hair grew out, the strands sort of became timelines that showed exactly when he had been poisoned. And when Cawley, through these tests, discovered that Bobby had been poisoned multiple times between October 1990 and September of 1991, these dates ruled out Bobby's coworkers and his brother David. The poisoning had simply started too early for David to be responsible and went on far too long for his coworkers to be guilty. But the timeline clearly ruled in Joanne. And when police began digging into why Joanne might have wanted to kill her husband, they realized she'd convinced Bobby to make her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy just days before poisoning him for the very first time. And so Joanne's motive was money. She did not want Bobby to have any of that financial windfall she was going to get from the death of her earlier husband, the wrongful death lawsuit where she was going to get $1 million, even though she kind of acted like, oh yeah, Bobby's going to use some of that to start his business. She didn't want that. She did not want him to have any of it. That was her money. So that was one motivation financially, and the other financial motivation was by killing Bobby, she would also receive the life insurance payout. As for where Joanne actually got the thallium, she would admit that she had used an old container of rat poison that did contain thallium that was manufactured in the US before thallium was banned in household products. On December 12, 1996, 5 years after Bobby's death, Joanne was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Joanne ultimately pled guilty and so was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. She would wind up serving all 20 years and was released from prison in 2016. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Just after midnight on May 12, 2006, a man woke up inside of his quiet London suburb to the sound of pounding on his front door. He immediately got up and went and answered it, and he found one of his neighbors standing outside looking completely shocked. And the neighbor told the man that something horrible had happened to his sister. And so right away after hearing this, the man left his house and sprinted down the road towards his sister's house. And as he was running, he was terrified of what he was going to find because he was always warning his sister to be more careful, but she never listened. And then when he got to his sister's house, the first thing he saw was a trail of blood leading down her driveway. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is waiting for a very important piece of mail, make sure you sit outside near their mailbox, wait for it to arrive, and then immediately take it and put it in the shredder. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of May 11, 2006, a 29-year-old hairdresser named Nisha Patel Nasri sat down for a rare break in between clients inside of her hair salon in the Wembley district of London. Nisha had opened up the salon when she was just 18 years old, and she'd been running it herself for the last 11 years. And in that time, she'd attracted around 2,000 regular customers, which was already very impressive. But it was particularly impressive because this was not like a big salon on a bustling city street. Instead, it was a tiny shop on a quiet residential road way out in the northwest suburbs of London. She actually ran the salon out of a single room in her brother's house, but through hard work and sheer talent, she had grown it into a thriving business. Now, generally speaking, Nisha was glad to be busy, because if she was busy, it meant she was making money. But sometimes, like right this second, stopping and kind of kicking back and relaxing for a second when she could felt very welcome. So she plopped down into a salon chair, she grabbed the morning paper, and she started reading it. The front page story was about how the government had just released its report on the previous year's July 7th bombings, which were a series of terrorist attacks that had taken place on London's trains and buses during the morning rush hour. Now, it had been almost 10 months since these horrific attacks, but Londoners still did not feel safe. Because of this attack, there was this growing fear of really all types of violent crime that could be visited upon them. It just felt like this shattered their worldview. And Nisha, more than most people, could really understand why people felt that way. In fact, she personally had experienced an attempted home invasion recently. Just 5 days ago, when Nisha had been at her house, located about a block away from the salon, she had been making dinner when she'd begun to hear the front mail slot rattling. So on her front door, there was a slot that could open up from the outside where the mail person could slide mail into her house. Now, when Nisha heard this, she didn't immediately, panic. It's pretty normal for mail to be dropped off through her door. But, she was curious, so she walked to the front of the house and she looked out the window to see who it was. Was it the mail person? Was it a neighbor? Was it a friend? But when she looked out, it was none of those people. It were these 3 men wearing dark clothes who she didn't know who they were, and they were clearly trying to break into her house. But these men had picked the wrong house to rob, because in addition to being a hairdresser, Nisha was also a special constable, which was basically a part-time volunteer police officer. So instead of her, hiding or calling for help, she'd just gone out to confront the men herself. And they'd been so caught off guard by how confidently she strode out there and called them off that they'd literally just turned and ran away. Now, even though Nisha had really handled this quite well and basically scared these guys away, it left her feeling really unsettled. And so that, combined with the lasting trauma that Londoners felt because of the bombings of the year before, Nisha these days was feeling very much on edge. However, every time Nisha found herself sort of defaulting to that victim mindset, being fearful that something else terrible is going to happen to her, she would remind herself that, she was a special constable, and whatever problems were thrown her way, she would handle them like she always did. But even though for Nisha that was sort of a confidence booster, for other people in Nisha's family, they weren't so thrilled she was a special constable. In particular, her older brother, Caton, the one who actually owned the house where Nisha ran her salon, he had pleaded with her not to join the special constable program because he felt like the work was way too dangerous. There were constantly stories in the papers about attacks on police. And unlike full-time officers, special constables were not authorized to use weapons to defend themselves. But for Nisha, that had never been an issue. She felt very proud of what she was doing, especially now that everybody was so on edge after the July 7th bombings. Now was the time for people to continue to step up and keep London safe, and so she felt like that's what she was doing. And so as Nisha finished reading the front page of the paper, she heard a bell jingle on the front door of the salon. So she tucked the newspaper away, hopped up, and went to go greet her next client. Later that night, around 10 p.m., Nisha closed up shop and swept the salon floor. And then a few minutes later, she heard the front door jingle again, and she looked up and saw her husband, whose name was Fadi Nasri, walking in with a paper bag of takeout food. Nisha instinctively shouted up the stairs for her brother, Caton, who had come home from work earlier that evening and had been hanging out in his part of the house since then. And a moment later, he came down the stairs to join the couple for some food. Fadi spread out the plastic containers of Indian food on the coffee table in the waiting area, and Caton began eating, while Fadi went ahead and sat down in Nisha's salon chair to get his haircut. And Nisha was even more careful than usual with his haircut, because she and her husband were going to their brother's wedding in a couple of days, and Nisha and Fadi knew they'd be in all the wedding pictures, and so they wanted to look their best. While she cut Fadi's hair, she helped her brother talk through preparations for the wedding. Their mother and father had both passed away years ago, so when it came to big family events like this, the two siblings were kind of on their own. Caton reminisced about how he'd given Nisha away at her own wedding, which was exactly 3 years ago yesterday, since their own father couldn't. Nisha smiled as she continued cutting Fadi's hair. Thinking about their wedding anniversary reminded her how grateful she was for her husband and the life they'd built together since. A few months after they had gotten married, Nisha had loaned Fadi some money to open up a limousine rental company, and his business had really taken off. And Nisha was proud to see her husband working these long hours and making great money. It felt like they really were a team, two ambitious, successful business owners working together to build a better future. Once Fadi's haircut was done, Nisha called Caton over and she gave him a pre-wedding trim as well. And as she finished up, Caton asked her if maybe she wanted to spend the night here at his house. He was still rattled by that attempted break-in at Nisha's house a couple of days earlier, and he really didn't feel like she was safe in her own home. But Nisha said, no, we're fine. So around 11 p.m., Nisha and her husband Fadi walked back to their house, which was, again, right around the corner. Their house was a cream-colored, two-story home with red shingles on the roof. And along with Fadi's car in the driveway, there was a stretch limo and a Humvee parked on the curb that Fadi used for work, and which both very much stood out in their middle-class neighborhood. Nisha unlocked the door and then tossed her phone and keys on the sofa and then went upstairs to get ready for bed. But while she was in the bathroom washing her face, Fadi popped his head in and told her he was heading out to go meet with his friend to go play snooker, which is a way of saying pool, but in the UK. Now, Nisha was not offended that he wanted to go out and see his friend, like that was fine. But in reality, she and her husband had been talking about wanting to start a family. And for the most part, they both agreed that now was the time to, try to have kids. And so when she was thinking about tonight, she was thinking, maybe we could, try to have a baby tonight. But it just seemed like not only tonight, but just generally speaking, every time there was like a window to, try to have a kid, Fadi was either too tired or he was going out with friends, or it just seemed like he would say he was interested, but then when it was time to actually do the thing, he was nowhere to be found. And so it seemed like that was happening again tonight. But it was late, and Nisha didn't feel like arguing with her husband, so she dried her face and just told Fadi to have fun with his friend. A few minutes later, as Nisha brushed her teeth, she heard the sound of her husband's car pulling out of the driveway. A little bit later, she went downstairs and turned off the lights and locked the doors, and then went back upstairs and crawled into bed alone. But then, about 30 minutes later, right as Nisha is about to fall asleep, she hears these footsteps in her house, and she didn't hear the sound of her husband return home. She just hears these footsteps downstairs. And so she sits up and she's hearing these sounds, and she thinks to herself, it could be my husband. Or, because just less than a week ago, somebody tried to break into her house, she's thinking, are they back? Has someone broken into my house? And so not sure who was down there, she got out of bed quietly, grabbed a flashlight, tiptoed out of her room, and then began heading downstairs to see who was in her house. A few minutes later, one of Nisha's neighbors was woken up by blood-curdling screams in the street outside his house. He jumped out of bed, went to the window, pulled back the curtain, and when he looked out, he saw Nisha limping down the street in her nightgown with a flashlight in her hand. And so the neighbor instinctively called for an ambulance and then rushed outside to help Nisha. And when he caught up with Nisha, she was hobbling back up her own driveway, and he asked her if she was okay, and she just choked out that she'd been stabbed. But before she could say who stabbed her, she collapsed onto the pavement, clutching this bloody spot on her thigh. At this exact moment, the neighbor looked up from Nisha, and he saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away down the street. By this point also, more people were trickling out onto the road, and another woman ran over to Nisha and put a towel on her leg and began pressing on the wound. And then as soon as the first neighbor who had gone outside and seen Nisha, as soon as he heard the ambulance coming down the road, he stood up and he bolted down the road to go find Nisha's brother and tell him what had happened and what he had seen. Over this past winter break, when myself, my wife, and my 3 kids were home, I was sent this package of My Mochi, which is like ice cream, these little bites of premium ice cream wrapped in this sweet, chewy dough. And I was told, like, hey, try this out, see if you like it, and see if you want to advertise this product. And I'm like, all right, I obviously tried the product, and I am hooked on My Mochi. Like, seriously, I was blown away by how good these things are. I was sent strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. And let me tell you, cookies and cream is out of this world. It's so refreshing. That's the way my wife and I refer to My Mochi, as being like very refreshing. And so we plow through all this mochi we got sent, and literally we went out before this big snowstorm. We went out to the grocery store before it shut down because of the storm, just to buy all the mochi we could. Crushed it. It's so good. It's only 70 calories. It's gluten-free. It's so good, you gotta try it. My Mochi, it's the best. Each purple box comes with 6 perfectly portioned mochi snacks, available in mouth-watering flavors like strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. Cookies and cream, really quite good. Feel joyfully chill with every bite of My Mochi ice cream. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. It's really, really good. Just moments later, a few minutes before midnight, Detective Chief Inspector Nick Scola felt his pager buzz. He was an experienced detective working out of the Wembley station, and that night he was the senior investigator on call in case any major crimes happened. He'd been hoping he could get through the shift without any emergencies, but when he called the station to see what that pager buzz was about, he could tell, there was clearly an emergency because the dispatcher told him to go to 17 Sudbury Avenue as quickly as possible. And so Scola hopped in his car, and a few minutes later, he pulled up to a very chaotic scene on a residential street. In the driveway of a cream-colored house with red shingles, paramedics were loading this young woman into an ambulance, and police officers were already cordoning off the area with tape to keep a crowd of very rowdy and restless neighbors away. As Scola walked closer to this house, he saw there was a trail of blood on the driveway. He flashed his badge to the other officers standing guard around the house, and they all lifted the crime scene tape to let him come inside. One of the officers told Scola there had been a stabbing, and the victim, the young woman, was in critical condition. And while the officers were debriefing him on what they knew so far, Scola noticed a car pull up out on the street. And a man got out of the car and began running towards the house, and as he did, he was clearly crying and screaming and just basically hysterical. As he got close enough, Scola heard this man frantically tell the paramedics that he was the victim's husband. And so Scola saw this happening and just made a mental note to make sure he interviewed that guy as soon as he had any idea what he was dealing with. Scola looked around and he noticed right away that there was a stretch limousine and also a black Humvee parked in front of this house, which, obviously those are expensive. And so, maybe those attracted burglars to the house and, maybe she was there when burglars went inside. So wrong place, wrong time. But when Scola walked up the driveway past the forensics team who was already taking photos and collecting evidence, he noticed that the front door and the windows near the front door had no signs of forced entry. There was no damage done. And then also when Scola went around to the back of the house, the back door, the other entrance into the house, also did not show any sign of forced entry. And then when Scola went into the house, he noticed that in the living room, there was nothing broken or anything out of place, and in fact, he even saw a wallet and a stack of cash sitting out in the open, totally untouched. And so even though his initial theory was robbery, it was starting to look less and less likely. Scola left the living room and went into the kitchen. And there, he noticed there was a butcher block that was clearly missing one of its knives. And this butcher block was at the very back of the counter behind a bunch of other items, including a row of champagne glasses that did not look like they had been disturbed. So he figured that, this knife could not have been taken during a struggle, like somebody, fighting with the victim, they grab the knife and then they stab her. The knife had to have been taken when there was relative peace in the house. Otherwise, those champagne glasses and the other stuff near the butcher's block would have been toppled over, and they weren't. And so Scola began to kind of piece together a working theory of what could have happened here. And what he came up with was the victim, the young woman, must have heard a noise that spooked her. And so she wound up going into her kitchen and she carefully got her knife to protect herself and then maybe stepped outside to investigate this noise. And as soon as she got out there, her attacker or whoever was out there making the noises, maybe they were trying to break in or something, they must have seen her, they get into some sort of altercation, the knife gets pulled out of her hand, and then she is stabbed with her own knife. Now, of course, this was really specific, and Scola had no idea if this was true or not, but it would sort of explain away all the anomalies he was seeing so far. A few minutes later, Scola went outside to speak to some of the neighbors who had gathered in the street. And one neighbor told Scola that he had actually seen a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away from the scene. But this neighbor said he had not seen the man's face, so he didn't know who it was. And so at this point, Scola figured the next thing he would need to do is just speak to the victim once she was stable, because she would obviously be able to give a better description of what happened and who her attacker actually was. But unfortunately, less than an hour later, while Scola was still at the crime scene, just kind of taking it all in and asking basic questions and gathering some evidence, he got a call from the hospital. His stabbing victim, Nisha Patel Nasri, had actually bled to death on the way to the hospital, which meant this was officially a murder investigation. The next morning, after Detective Scola was finally done processing the scene, he walked into the Wembley police station, and it was unusually quiet. The other officers looked very somber. A little bit confused, Scola asked one of his colleagues what was going on here, and she would tell him that the victim, Nisha from last night's murder, was one of their own. She was a special constable, and plenty of officers in the Wembley station had worked with her. And so Scola now understood, what a gut punch this really was. But also, this information was pretty interesting to Scola, because at first, he thought Nisha was killed in like a random robbery gone wrong. But now, Scola wondered if this murder was not random at all. Maybe Nisha was being targeted because she was a police officer. Maybe there was a criminal who she had put behind bars or prosecuted in some way that was out to get her. And when Scola began doing some digging on Nisha and some of her police work, he learned that Nisha had actually had somebody try to break into her house a few days earlier. There were these 3 men that she had basically scared off when they had tried to break into her house. And so now Scola's thinking, that can't be a coincidence. And so right away, a team of officers got to work trying to figure out the identities of those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house the first time. And so while the officers did that, Scola headed back to the crime scene to go see if he could find that knife that was missing from the kitchen. He figured at this point that had to be the murder weapon. And if it was, the killer's fingerprints or DNA could be on the knife. When Scola pulled up on Sudbury Avenue a little bit later, he saw swarms of reporters and TV cameras crowding around the house, where the crime scene tape was still up, keeping them back. And as Scola approached the house, a reporter noticed him and ran towards him with a microphone and began asking him questions. Namely, did the police have any idea why a special constable had been murdered at her own home? But Scola brushed the reporter off. He was not about to talk about this case yet. He really did not have any information to give up anyways. And he ducked under the police tape. Once inside the cordoned off area, Scola saw there were dozens of officers already scouring the area looking for this missing knife, dumping out trash cans and digging through the bushes. Scola caught one of the investigators' eyes and she kind of shrugged, which Scola took to mean that they hadn't found it yet. Scola also watched as 2 other officers hauled this high-powered vacuum out of a truck and over to a storm drain on the curb. And then they turned on this vacuum and began sucking up everything out of the drain, presumably to look for this knife. Scola walked over to them right as they began sifting through what they had sucked up. The vacuum had pulled up a whole bunch of stuff between leaves and trash and food wrappers, but ultimately there was no knife. Scola figured the killer must have dumped this knife somewhere near the crime scene, because they couldn't have gotten far before they realized they needed to get rid of it. And so Scola felt confident that this knife was going to turn up eventually. They just had to keep on looking. In the meantime, Scola went back inside the house, where he found a pair of investigators sitting in the living room with Nisha's husband, Fadi. And Fadi had his phone out, and he was playing a recording of this woman shouting violent threats. One of the officers who saw Scola pulled him aside and caught him up to speed. They said that Fadi had a solid alibi for the time of Nisha's murder. He was with a friend playing snooker a few miles away, and that friend had already confirmed it. And the officer also told Scola that Fadi had come forward and said that he already had a pretty good idea of who might have killed his wife. And so Scola sat down on the couch next to Fadi, and Fadi at that point started his story from the beginning. He said that 2 months ago, he'd gotten into a feud with a rival limo business owner in Scotland. He said that he had sold a Humvee to this other company under the condition that after the sale, Fadi could borrow it back for one last job. But the other company's owner had gone back on the deal and refused to let him borrow the car after the transaction. So in a moment of what he was calling poor judgment, Fadi had traveled to Scotland, rented the Humvee under a fake name, and driven it all the way back to London. But then Fadi said, while he was driving back to London, clearly the other owner figured out what Fadi was up to, because they gave Fadi a call, and Fadi recorded the voicemail they left. And so Fadi played the recording of this other business owner for Scola. And Scola, he heard this woman screaming over and over again that she was going to kill Fadi and his wife if he didn't bring her Humvee back. And as Scola listened, he thought this woman did not sound like she was joking. This seemed like a real threat. Now, Fadi said he did return the Humvee. He gave it back to the business owner, and so she no longer had a reason to kill him and his wife. Still, though, Fadi felt strongly that, this woman really had it out for them, and so he wanted the police to look into her. And for Scola, they really didn't have that many leads to think of, and so he figured he would check it out first. So he took Fadi's phone to download that audio recording and also all the call logs, and then he promised he would send a team to Scotland to look into this right away. One afternoon, about a month later, Detective Scola sat in his office alone, going over the case files again and again. He was stressed because the media had been covering Nisha's murder since day one, and there was a lot of public pressure to solve this case. But the police had been investigating it really aggressively for a month, but realistically had almost nothing to show for it. Ever since Scola's last conversation with Fadi, the investigation had been moving very slowly. Some detectives had gone to Scotland to look into this rival business owner angle who had, supposedly threatened Fadi and his wife, but they hadn't found anything notable. So that lead was looking like a bust. Also, the homicide team had not been able to identify those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house 5 days before she was killed. Scola and his team had interviewed Nisha's family, her friends, her neighbors, but so far they had not been able to identify any likely suspects, again outside of that business owner in Scotland. It just didn't seem like there was anyone who would have wanted to hurt Nisha. She was liked and respected by basically everyone they spoke to. However, there had been one pretty significant development in the case over the past month, and it was that police had finally found a knife that looked similar to the one missing from Nisha's kitchen. It was found in a storm drain about a block away from her house. However, Scola was still waiting for the crime lab to actually determine whether it was the murder weapon or not. But just then, Scola got a phone call, and it was someone from the crime lab. And they told him that after analyzing this knife, they had found traces of Nisha's blood on the blade. So this definitely was the murder weapon. For the first time in weeks, Scola felt really optimistic. He finally had a real piece of hard evidence, a fresh clue here to really lead this investigation. And now he needed all hands on deck. So he hung up the phone and then gathered his team for a meeting. And then once they were all together, he told the other detectives that they had found the murder weapon. But they had to keep their discovery a secret. If the killer found out police had this knife, they might panic and flee. And so to avoid jeopardizing the investigation, Scola wanted to keep the discovery out of the press. After everybody was aligned on that, the next step in the investigation was that Scola was going to send officers out to collect video from all the security cameras near where the knife had been found. London is one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the entire world, with hundreds of thousands of CCTV cameras everywhere. So Scola figured one of those cameras must have captured the person who dropped that knife into the drain. The homicide squad would spend the rest of the week combing through countless hours of CCTV footage from the area, hoping to find the moment when the knife got dropped in the storm drain. But it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. However, after about a week of this, another detective eagerly called Scola over to his computer. He said he had finally found something that could be useful. And so Scola walked over, and the detective said that the footage he was looking at, which was paused at the moment, was of a CCTV camera taken from a shop that was on the same road as the storm drain. And so Scola bent down and stared at the screen as the detective hit play on the video. Now, the storm drain itself was just barely out of frame, but the camera clearly captured the glow of headlights as a car pulled up near the storm drain. The car stopped there for about 7 seconds, and even though you cannot see anybody getting out and disposing of a knife into the drain, the car was stopped long enough that somebody could have done that before the car took off again. But critically, when this car took off again, it passed through this camera's frame very clearly. And as the car drove past the storefront, the detective paused the camera. As soon as he did, Scola leaned in closer to get a better look at this car. Now, the video was dark and grainy, so right away it was impossible to read the license plate on the car. But despite the graininess, there definitely were a few identifying details Scola could make out. The car was clearly a gray Audi, and there was an antenna in the center of the roof, and also one of the lights above the license plate was not working. Now, Scola knew there were literally tens of thousands of Audis in London, and so they knew the only way they'd track this one down is by sending officers out into the street to literally look for it. But really what they're looking for is Audis that have that antenna on the roof and a light that doesn't work in front. Now, of course, this was going to be extremely time-consuming, but Scola felt like they didn't have a better lead here, and so they began this process. And for the next few weeks, that's all they were doing, just out on the streets canvassing for this Audi, and they didn't find it. And so as this investigation was feeling like it was about to hit another dead end, Scola felt like he just couldn't let that happen. There was too much pressure on him to get this done. But then suddenly, he thought about something that he'd totally put out of his mind. Fadi's phone. They'd actually taken the phone from Fadi 2 months ago to download that voicemail and also download the call log, but they actually hadn't given it back to Fadi yet. They were just holding the phone in evidence right now. Now, Scola felt like that audio message on the phone really had not amounted to anything and likely wouldn't. But Scola figured, why don't we look in that phone to see what else is on there? Maybe there were fresh clues about who might have wanted to hurt Nisha. So he assigned one of his forensic techs to download everything from Fadi's phone onto a drive. And then once they had done that, Scola took this drive and he plugged it into his computer and began sorting through all this data. He saw a photo that caught his eye. The photo was of a woman's thigh, and she was clearly lying in a bed in what looked like a hotel room. And even with the bright flash and poor camera quality, Scola could tell that the woman's skin was pale white, and so it was definitely not Nisha's leg. After finding this photo on Fadi's phone, Scola immediately drove to Nisha and Fadi's house. And when Fadi opened the door, Scola stepped inside and showed him the photo and asked him point blank if he was having an affair. Fadi right away said no, and he insisted he would never do that to Nisha, and the woman in the picture was literally just a friend. Now, Scola immediately felt like Fadi was lying. He did not believe him for a second. But there was no way to, force Fadi to tell the truth. And so ultimately, all Scola could do was just leave, get back in his car, go back to the station. And on the drive there, he wondered to himself if he had sort of just blown that opportunity. Should he have waited for more solid evidence before confronting Fadi? But he was also thinking that, there's so much pressure on him to solve this case, that he just had to make moves like this, take some chances. And so it is what it is. When Scola got to the precinct, he parked his car and he went in his office to think. And almost as soon as he sat down, there was a knock at the door. It was a man named Sid Shenoy, who was the family liaison officer who'd been working with Nisha's family. His job was to support the grieving family and communicate with them throughout the investigation. And so as a result of this role he was playing, Sid had created a level of trust with the family that really none of the other detectives had with the family. And Shenoy, when he walked in the room, told Scola that he'd just gotten a really interesting call from Fadi. He said Fadi had confessed to something that he'd basically been too afraid to tell Scola in person when he had just been visiting him, a couple minutes ago. And so Shenoy told Scola that you really ought to call Fadi and let him tell you what he just told me. And so right away, that's what Scola did. He called Fadi. And Fadi, when he picked up, he sounded very nervous and anxious and ashamed as he broke down and admitted that actually, yes, he was having an affair. He had lied. He said the leg in the photo belonged to a woman named Laura Mocking, and she was a Lithuanian sex worker who he'd been seeing for 3 months before his wife's death. Fadi said the reason he had lied to Scola is because he didn't want Nisha's family to find out he'd been cheating on her. But Scola knew there was also another obvious reason to lie here, because an affair would clearly give Fadi a motive to kill his wife. Fadi had been crossed off the suspect list at this point just based on his alibi. But this affair now made him look very suspicious. However, Scola just felt like it just didn't make sense that Fadi would be the killer. Number one, he did have a strong alibi. And also, two, apart from hiding this affair, which you could justify, you could say that obviously he didn't want ripple effect damage on the family or something, he'd been very cooperative with the investigation. I mean, he'd given them his phone, which had this damning photo on it. I mean, he'd sort of been very forthright. And so a new theory began to take hold in Scola's mind. If Fadi wasn't the killer, maybe it was possible that his mistress, Laura, was, or at least was directly involved in some way. I mean, she would have all the reason in the world to want to get rid of Nisha. So on September 1st, almost 4 months after Nisha was murdered, her husband's mistress, Laura Mocking, was brought into the station on suspicion of murder. In the interrogation room, detectives confronted her with all the evidence they had gathered that showed her relationship with Fadi was not just a casual affair. The two of them had met at a brothel where Laura was working as a sex worker, but eventually she stopped charging him to see her, which likely meant she must have developed real feelings for him. And so the detectives suggested that, if Nisha was gone for good, Laura would have Fadi all to herself. Laura insisted she did not know anything about the murder, and then she gave them a solid alibi. But that didn't mean much, because eyewitnesses thought they saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away after Nisha was stabbed. So the working theory was if Laura was involved in this murder, it was pretty likely that she had hired somebody else to do the dirty work. However, the detectives did not have real evidence. And so, despite their suspicions, they had to release her. And then once again, they were back at square one. However, not long after Laura was allowed to go home, Scola was walking through the precinct when the family liaison officer, Sid Shenoy, came running up behind him. Shenoy told him that he just had a very interesting conversation with Nisha's brother, Caton. Caton had told him that after finding out about Fadi's affair, he had been furious. The whole family was so upset about it. And Caton said that now that he really had this horrible opinion of Fadi, he felt comfortable sharing something about Fadi that he had been keeping to himself. Caton told Shenoy that he thought Fadi might not be the professional businessman he pretended to be. Instead, Caton said that Fadi might actually be involved with something criminal. According to Caton, Fadi had said there were a lot of sketchy people in his contacts, and he was worried about what the police might find on his phone. But Caton said that Fadi had not been specific about what he meant when he said sketchy people. He didn't know what he was saying or why he was involved with them. And so after hearing this, Scola told his team to go through Fadi's phone records and run the name of every person who appeared in his call log. And apart from all the calls back and forth to Laura, the mistress, there was one other name that jumped out, a convicted drug dealer named Roger Leslie. And when Scola saw this, he realized that he might have been approaching this investigation all wrong. He'd really struggled to find suspects because there was no one who would have wanted to hurt Nisha who didn't have an alibi. But now he realized that maybe that was the case because Nisha was not actually the killer's target. Maybe the target was Fadi. If Fadi was involved in the drug trade, then anyone could have come after him for any number of reasons. It could have been a drug deal gone wrong, or retribution for a debt he didn't pay, or even maybe a hit by a rival gang. He didn't know, but there was way more possibilities here. And the more Scola dug into Fadi, the more suspicious evidence he found. He learned that before Fadi and Nisha got married, Fadi had run an escort agency. He'd closed it down and started a more legitimate business 3 years ago, but Scola knew there could be any number of former employees or customers wives who might still have a problem with Fadi. And then there was that threatening voicemail from the rival limo company. That whole story made it seem entirely possible that Fadi could easily get wrapped up in very serious business disputes, which meant there could be more disgruntled rivals out there. Basically, it seemed entirely possible that there were loads of people out there who might have had it out for Fadi, not Nisha. And so that became the new direction of this investigation. And so the first person Scola looked into with this new direction was Roger Leslie, the drug dealer who had made a few calls to Fadi. However, there was one issue that kept Roger from becoming a primary suspect. He didn't own a gray Audi. So if he was involved in the murder, he probably didn't work alone. And so the police set up a trace on Roger Leslie's phone, hoping that his call logs would lead them to an associate who did own a gray Audi. And eventually, they sure did. And that person who owned the gray Audi was the missing piece that made the whole puzzle come together. Based on those call logs and all the other evidence found during this investigation, the following is what police believe happened to Nisha Patel Nasri on May 11th, 2006. Around 11:50 p.m., just as Nisha was falling asleep, the killer pulled up to her house in the passenger seat of a gray Audi. The driver waited in the car while the killer got out and crept around to the back of the house. And as he walked to the back of the house, he kept looking in the windows to confirm all the lights were out. And they were. And then when he got to the back door, he pulled out a key he'd managed to get his hands on to open it up. And then once the door was open, he stepped inside. The killer slowly moved through the kitchen and then stopped because he heard the floorboards upstairs creaking. And so he held his breath as he realized that somebody upstairs was making their way downstairs. They were caught. The killer didn't know what to do. They hadn't prepared for this at all. He thought everybody in the house would be asleep. So he panicked and he reached over and pulled a knife out of that butcher's block in the kitchen and then ducked behind a wall to hide. He heard the footsteps getting closer and closer, and he's trying his best to hide, and then he saw a beam of a flashlight make its way into the kitchen, and then it comes across and lands squarely right on them. And the person holding that flashlight was Fadi's wife, Nisha. When Nisha saw the killer, she screamed and ran for the front door. But the killer knew he could not let her get away because now she'd gotten a clear look at his face and he was caught. So he chased her outside, out into the driveway, clutching that kitchen knife in his hand, and about halfway down the driveway, he tackled her and then sunk the knife deep into her thigh. Nisha actually managed to fight him off despite this gaping wound in her leg, and she scrambled up and began running down the street screaming for help. And at this point, the killer saw lights coming on in the neighbors' houses, and his heart was pounding, and he knew that Nisha was no longer his biggest problem. He had to get out of here immediately before anybody on the block saw his face too. So he just sprinted back to the Audi, where the driver was still waiting for him, and he told the driver to go, just take off, drive out of here. And so the driver, they did just that, but they were panicked and confused, and as they're going around the corner, they're asking the killer, like, what just happened? I mean, as far as the driver knew, they were only here to pick up some ecstasy for a drug deal. They did not expect anybody to get stabbed. But the killer just snapped at the driver to stop talking about it because he hadn't expected the night to go this way either. It was a total mess. And so at this point, the killer looked down at the bloody knife that was still in his hand, and he realized he had to get rid of it. And so he told the driver to just pull over. And so the driver did. They pulled over to the curb on this commercial street just a block away from Nisha's house, and the killer quickly opened up the door and threw the knife into a nearby storm drain. Then he slammed the door shut again, and as the Audi careened down the road, the killer took the driver's cell phone out of the cup holder and called the man who'd hired him to tell him everything that had just gone horribly wrong. The person he called was the drug dealer, Roger Leslie. However, when Roger got off that phone call with the killer, Roger immediately called the person who'd hired him. Roger had actually been hired to pull off a hit, but he didn't want to get his own hands dirty, so he'd outsourced the job. But now, after having spoken to the killer about this botched hit where basically they stabbed her and they had no idea if she actually was going to die or not, in fact, the last thing they saw was her running down the road screaming for help, now Roger knew he would have to explain himself to the actual mastermind of the murder plot, the person who'd given him the key to get inside. And that person was indeed Fadi Nasri, Nisha's husband. It turned out that Fadi was involved with a bunch of criminals, but they weren't after him. They were his friends. Because even though Fadi pretended to be this successful, legitimate businessman, he really was not. He was deep in debt, and he'd paid Roger Leslie to kill Nisha for the life insurance money. That way he could pay his debts and then also run off with his new mistress, Laura. And so while Nisha had been wanting to start a family and was starting to sense that maybe Fadi was not fully committed to that idea, well, her instincts were good because it turned out Fadi did not want to start a family with her. He wanted to kill her and move on. According to prosecutors, that earlier break-in at Nisha and Fadi's house a few days before she was killed was very likely either a reconnaissance mission or a failed first attempt to kill Nisha. In the end, 4 people were arrested and charged with Nisha's murder. They were Fadi Nasri, Roger Leslie, the hitman who actually stabbed Nisha, his name was Jason Jones, and the driver of the car, a man named Tony Emanuel. Now, the driver was acquitted, but the other 3 men were all convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.